Welcome to everyone, and welcome to this, our Land Day 2021 webinar. It is entitled The Palestinian People's Future Within the Ongoing Zionist Settler, Colonial and Apartheid Project. And we'll just prepare now to get started. I think most people are in from the waiting room. I'm Karen Rodman, and I will just make a couple of introductory comments and then turn it over to our moderator and two panelists. So again, welcome to this Land Day 2021 webinar entitled The Palestinian People's Future Within the Ongoing Zionist Settler, Colonial and Apartheid Project. It's a conversation with Sabri Jiryis, the former director of the Palestine Research Center and an author of a book from 1966, The Arabs in Israel, that has really changed my understanding of those first 20 years after the Nakba when I first read it. This, also, the other panelist that is with us is Jonathan Kuttab, who also is a co-founder of our organization, Just Peace Advocates, and on the board, and an international human rights lawyer. And his fairly new book, just the end of 2020, Beyond the Two-State Solution, we'll also be visiting that today. We're especially pleased to have Aseel al Bajeh, who's a legal researcher and advocacy officer at Al-Haq in Palestine, moderating this event. The webinar is hosted by Just Peace Advocates, which is a Canadian-based organization, human rights organization, focused on Palestine, Kashmir, and other areas of self-determination and justice and human rights and international law. As we consider today the settler colonization ongoing of Palestine, Just Peace Advocates also recognizes our own settler presence here on the indigenous land of Turtle Island, and the founding of Canada being based on colonial violence, both historic, but unfortunately very much ongoing as well in our own context today. We are live streaming this event. It's to the Just Peace Advocates Facebook page. So we encourage you to share that link with your friends who may not have registered, or if you want to visit that link after to re-listen, you'll be able to do that. I'll put the link into the chat shortly and also get it up onto the event page on Facebook. We will put it up onto YouTube after as well. We remind you that all conversation needs to be respectful and no racism will be tolerated. And we look forward to your engagement and look forward to the questions that you're going to pose using the question option, or you can have a conversation with the panelists as well through the chat. And we'll attempt to get to as many questions as at all possible. So now I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today's session. Aseel al Bajeh is a legal researcher and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, the human rights organization in Palestine, in Ramallah. She holds an LLM in international human rights law from the Irish Center for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway. In addition to her academic research, which focused on transitional justice and decolonization of Palestine, Aseel also writes opinion articles for several media outlets, including the Electronic Intifada, Al Jazeera blogs, and the New Arab. Aseel, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen, for this warm introduction and welcome. And welcome everyone, wherever you're joining us. Good morning and good evening. It's such a pleasure to be facilitating today's event with such amazing speakers and writers and activists who will enrich the conversation today. So as Karen highlighted, we are today commemorating Land Day, which will be on the 30th of March. The 30th of March is a very central date in the Palestinian collective memory, and it marks the 30th of March 1976 killing of 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel by the Israeli police in the Galilee while they were protesting land expropriation in the Galilee. And it is important to note that this incident highlights as also Karen highlighted, the ongoing nature and the historical nature of the settler-colonial regime, Israeli colonial regime in Palestine. So Land Day for Palestinians is a day to highlight that land dispossession and suppression of Palestinian resistance is historical as well as ongoing. And it is part of course, of the Zionist Settler-colonial project to control the Palestinian land with the least Palestinian indigenous population in it. Land Day further serves to remind the world that the Palestinian people are inseparable wherever they are, and as much as the the Israeli colonial project tries to fragment the Palestinian people, we are inseparable under different in different locations in the refugees, Palestinian refugees and Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territory, all are facing the same Zionist settler colonial project and apartheid regime. So today we will go with our speakers into a journey in the past, in history, as well as to discuss the current status of what is going on the ground today, and as well as the future. So I will give a short introduction of our speakers today. Mr. Jiryis is a Palestinian lawyer, researcher, and writer. He began his career at an early age in the Galilee, joining the founding members of Al-Ard, the first Palestinian movement in Israel to call for national rights and a Palestinian state. He worked as a writer and researcher at the Institute for Palestine Studies and later at the Palestine Research Center, eventually directing the center. And as Karen mentioned, he's the author of two amazing books, The Arabs in Israel, published in '66, and also A History of Zionism, which has two parts. Mr. Jonathan Kuttab is the co-founder of the Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq, where I'm currently working. He's a very well-known international human rights attorney. He practices in the US, Palestine, and Israel. He also co-founded Nonviolence International. He serves on the board of Bethlehem Bible College and is a founding director of Just Peace Advocates, which is hosting today's event. He's also the author of Beyond the Two-State Solution book, which will be also explored in today's discussion. And just to give an overview of what we will be discussing today, we will start with Mr. Jiryis, who will explore the historical land dispossession and domination of the Palestinian citizens of Israel under the military rule in the first early years of the establishment of the settler colonial state of Israel. And also he will talk about the Land Day. Then we will move to Mr. Jonathan, who will talk about the same regime, but focusing more on the occupied Palestinian territory and land dispossession mechanisms and mechanisms to control the Palestinian people in the occupied territory. And the third part of our webinar, we will have a joint conversation between our speakers on Mr. Jonathan's book, Beyond the Two-State Solution, where we will explore the future of the Palestinian people. So without further delay, I will turn the mic to Mr. Sabri to start the conversation. You can unmute yourself. So we'll have like a 10 minutes presentation on what you want to say about the historical land dispossession and domination of the Palestinian people, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Is it my turn now? Okay, thank you, everybody. Let me start by saying we are now noticing the 1976 Land Day, which happened within Israel in the Galilee and the Triangle areas. But in fact, this is not the only land day. We have too many land days in the history of Palestine and the history of the conflict with the settler colonialism of the Zionists. Land days could be traced back through a period of at least 140 years since the end of the 19th century up to date. And you can find such similar days, more land days, bigger or smaller, over all of this period of 140 years. Latest, about a week ago or 10 days ago, when a Palestinian was shot in the head and killed in the West Bank because he was trying to defend his land from being seized by the settlers with the help of the Israeli army. And let me make the issue, present it in a very simple way, very simple and concise way, and within one or two sentences. This is the problem of the Palestinian fight with Zionism. What is Zionism in two sentences? It is a settler colonialist movement that wants to establish, and in fact, it did establish a state for the Jews in Palestine through dominating the land by buying it and later by occupying it. You don't need to say more about the nature of Zionism. That has been its activity. These are its goals since it was established. It started working in the middle, the second half of the 19th century and up to date. Now, during the Mandate days, during the Turkish days, the Ottoman days in Palestine, up to 1918, they could infiltrate in and buy some stretches of land from landlords who were not in Palestine, but were living in other countries, neighboring countries, in Beirut and Damascus, namely, and most important, the Circus family in Beirut, where they established the first settlements on land that they purchased from them and then evicted the tenants from it. Later, after the mandate, the British mandate was imposed in Palestine, they were trying to buy land here and there up to 1948, when they could, the Zionists could own something like 5% of the total area of Palestine, which of course was not enough to establish a state or even a mini state. The big change has happened after the 1948 war, 48-49 war, in which the Israelis occupied then about something like 70% of Palestine, driving away all of its inhabitants of the area they had seized, and then seizing their lands. No kidding, no playing, just like that, simply like that. Now, by dominating that land, after dominating that area and declaring the establishment of the State of Israel, there remained inside Israel a minor, small Palestinian majority, something like 170,000 Palestinian Arabs. I was one of them. Then a very small, very young boy. This minority have grown up to become now about something like 2 million people. Then we were subjected, to a military, to the military rule, the closed areas, all kinds of persecution. And during the 50s, they could sneak away, they could snatch away something, according to my research and calculations, like 2 million Dunams. Dunam is 100 square meters of land from the Arabs inside Israel. Now, what caused about this land day of 1967, 1776, is that the Israelis were going on and they wanted to confiscate the big stretches of land in a mainly Arab area in Galilee. And that it made the people revolt, and the Israelis tried to crush it. They killed some people, about 5 or 6 of them, and there was a big noise then. And then it was called the Land Day. In fact, after this episode, the Israelis more or less have stopped seizing land from the Arabs inside Israel, from the inside Israel, and they shifted their activities. In fact, years before they started that, to the occupied territories in the West Bank and in Gaza City. In Gaza, they had to leave and they had nothing more to do that. But in the West Bank, up to now, they are very active. And I can tell you what's the problem. I mean, what's the motto about this? What's the rationale about it? It is that they have the idea, they have the ideology that wherever they have a settlement, wherever they settle, the land belongs theirs, it belongs to them. And that's why they are trying to separate their settlements everywhere. And if they cannot settle everywhere, they create, as you see now in the West Bank, too many what is called observation posts. They take 1 or 2 or 3 settlers, they put them in a certain area under the protection of the army, just in order, to make more restrictions on the Palestinians and prevent them more and more from using their lands and their resources. These policies, which have been going for quite a long time, to our good, let's say for one way or other, it does not look that it's going on and that it's going to be so successful, because it is raising too much resistance to it, and it is becoming more and more an international issue. By now, as you know, everybody almost in the world considers the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza as an occupied territory. Settlements and confiscation of land is prohibited there. And now most of the big powers, even everybody in the world, I think, I don't know about somebody who approves of that. Everybody is against this Israeli activities, including Americans, Russians, Chinese, Europeans, Muslims, and everybody. And to my, let us say, a little bit joy, in the end, this issue has reached the International Criminal Court. And I suppose that this there would be one of the big issues and one of the most important issues that have to be dealt with. In fact, neither the international law, nor the UN, nor the Security Council, or the General Assembly, or any other board in the world do approve of the Israelis' activities in these areas. Even some of the Israelis themselves don't approve of it, and they oppose it on the ground that if there are too many Israelis in the West Bank and Gaza, in fact, there are more Israelis, it would lead to a one-state solution, of which the Zionists are too much afraid, because they think that in the end, the Palestinians would be the majority in this state and rule it. And so that's why they oppose it. But anyway, I think to conclude, the situation of the solution to the situation is quite very clear. Having the two-state solution implemented, having the Israelis leaving by hook or crook the West Bank, giving the Palestinians back their rights and their independent state, and then dealing with the settler colonialists there, who in fact, up to now inside, I mean, especially inside the areas of the West Bank, they are a very minor, they are a real minority that don't have too much impact on the Palestinians in general.
Mr.
Hopefully,
Sabri, if you allow me to interrupt, because I know that you're now moving to the future, and I think this will be an amazing opportunity to explore in the third segment of our webinar, where we will discuss Mr. Jonathan's Beyond the Two-State Solution. I think it would be an amazing conversation between the both of you to discuss that. But thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting overview of, I would say, like 100 years of history in a very interesting and manner. I think if I just want to add one thing, and this is something I learned from reading your book, The Arabs in Israel, is that many of the Palestinians themselves even don't recognize what really happened under the 17 years of military rule, where Palestinian citizens of Israel were very brutally subjected to very strict and illegal, of course, policies under the shield of security measures, where their movement restrictions and it was just a tool to expropriate their land and to control their movement and to dominate them in order not to be.
That's right. You are right. You are right. You know what?
Of course.
From 1948, let me just give you this a simple piece of information. Until I left Israel in 1970. Okay, that means something like 22 years, right? Me personally, I was never able to move freely inside Israel. I had always, although I was a practicing lawyer and I was a student before that at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, wherever I have to go, I have to get a permit, either from the military governor or from the police, a written permit in my hand to travel from one place to the other, which was imposed on too many Palestinians, and later it was relaxed. As long as they are needed to confiscate the land, they kept this, these repressive measures, preventing people from going to their lands, from moving around, from etc., and then gradually seizing the land. And later, after they have seized it and finished it and settled it, they started easing that, making, making these restrictions more easy, and in the end they abolished them. Right. But even when they abolished them in 1966, me and somebody like 90 or 100 people of troublemakers, we still got, personal notices.
They call you the radicalized Arab.
That these, the relaxation of the military government, the changes do not apply to us. Okay, every year they were sending me and the others a written notice informing me that the military government is still valid for me.
I think this is why Land Day in particular is very important. It's just to highlight that the Palestinian people, even when they have been subjected to a very brutal ruling to control them and to make them forget about their belonging to the land, they still protested such the further expansion of the Settler-colonial project. And this is also, I think it's now very interested to move to our next speaker, who will talk about such similar policies which were moved in 1967 into the occupied Palestinian territory, where now Israel is in control of the whole land of Palestine. And I give the mic to Mr. Jonathan now.
Thank you. I think Sabri placed the proper framework of the conflict. It is a very basic conflict between the local Palestinian Arab population, who, like all people, aspire to self-determination, freedom, independence in their own state, and between the settler-colonial movement of Zionism, which purported, at least, to want to create a Jewish state, as Jewish as France is French. And to do that, they had to change the demography, bring in a lot of Jews, and push out as many non-Jews as they can. But they also had to acquire as much of the land as possible and to keep it exclusively for Jews. Not just to acquire it in the national sense of making it Israeli, but making it Jewish, subject only to Jews. Now, in 1967, there was a real watershed. The first was, of course, the Israeli victory in the 67 war, which allowed it to capture all of historic Palestine, including the Golan Heights and their portion from Egypt as well. But then they decided to use law and legal schemes to implement their program. And the way they did that legally was by keeping the existing law in place, not bringing Israeli law, but then adjusting it through military orders. Today, there are over 2,000 military orders affecting each and every area of life, from land to water to economy to finance to health to education to transportation, you name it, zoning. All laws have been changed, and changed specifically in order to advance the Zionist project of making the place Jewish and of controlling the local population, the non-Jewish population, limiting its growth, limiting its development, limiting its movement, limiting its political life, its cultural expression at every level. Over 2,000 military orders. Now, 1967 was a major watershed because in a real way, it changed the practicalities of the conduct of this conflict between the settler-colonial movement and the local population. One of the things that it did was introduce the idea as a compromise of a two-state solution. Somehow Israel would agree to return or give up the land that it acquired in 1967. In return, the Arabs, the Palestinians, and all the Arab world would sort of accept Israel as a Jewish state in the 78% of the land that it acquired before. This idea, the two-state solution, was a huge compromise and very difficult for the Arabs to accept, to give up more than 3/4 of their land to what they considered are settler colonialist outsiders who have come in. On the other hand, the international community felt very comfortable with this idea. They didn't have to deal with the nature of the conflict. They didn't have to deal with Zionism and what does it mean to have a Jewish state. They didn't have to deal with continuing a fight between Arabs and Jews in Palestine and in the whole area. And it just so happened that international law was very useful in this regard because it didn't allow any states to acquire the land of other states. It didn't allow any settler movement into the occupied territory. It didn't allow collective punishment, human rights violations. So slowly this became the international standard to be followed, the two-state solution. And gradually, even the Palestinians and the PLO accepted this solution as a compromise of their historic rights in all of Palestine. Now, there were always people who objected to this compromise, but it seemed to make a lot of sense to people. And it seemed to be enshrined in international law. And the PLO itself accepted to move in that direction. The one basic problem with this compromise was that the Zionist movement, while it talked about a two-state solution, didn't really believe in it and didn't really implement it. By building settlements, exclusively Jewish settlements throughout the occupied territories, by continuing the same policies that they used in Israel itself that Sabri Jiryis talked about throughout the occupied territories to capture and take more land and make it exclusively for Jews, by introducing over, by now, I think 600,000 or 700,000 Jews into the occupied territories and establishing them as a permanent presence and creating for them a totally separate system of laws, of courts, of police, of education, of health, of services, of taxation, of rights, even a system of roads that serves them only. It was so blatantly racist and discriminatory and apartheid, but it became actually not only the established fact, but it also thoroughly undermined the idea of a two-state solution, because the small 22% of Palestine that was supposed to be a Palestinian state was now riddled throughout by these Jewish settlements who were becoming more and more prominent, so that instead of these settlements being like small islands within an Arab state, the places where the Arabs were living became small enclaves, totally unconnected with each other throughout a basically Jewish settler colonial regime. So at one point, the egg was scrambled so much that it really could not be unscrambled. And this brings about my suggestion. And I have to say, I was one of those who promoted and worked very hard for a two-state solution, as a strong believer in international law, as a strong believer that we need to find some compromise with this oppressive colonial movement that was basically taking our lives, that we have to deal with the reality that, especially in light of the anti-Semitism, especially in light of the Holocaust, especially in light of the tremendous support, financial, military, political, that much of the world was given to the state of Israel, particularly the United States, that it was important to somehow come to terms, to create a new reality. And in my humble opinion, that reality required a total rethinking of the paradigm itself. This conflict between a movement, the Zionist movement that wanted to make Palestine as Jewish as France is French, and between the Arab national movement that says this is Arab land and you guys are colonial settlers coming from outside. You don't belong here. To find a formula that allows the two groups to somehow live together in this land. Dividing the land was no longer, in my view, an option, and we had to start thinking more creatively about something else that can still be a humanitarian solution that addresses the basic needs of both people. I'm not sure that I have come with the best solution, but I think we need to make the conversation move in that direction. Somehow, the idea of two states became an easy alibi for Israel. It can continue to occupy the territory and rule all aspects of it, while every time we object, why are you doing this? As well, when you get your state, you will eventually be able to solve these problems. And when we have problems, we are told, you have your state in the making. They're responsible for your vaccines. They're responsible for your economy. They're responsible for your desire for a state or a parliament, or and if you have any problems, you have somebody to complain about. It's not us, it's your own Palestinian Authority that has failed to bring about what needs to be brought about. So this is the essence of what I wrote in a two-state solution. One last point before we move in that direction. The Zionist movement has worked very hard and in some degree succeeded in fragmenting the Palestinian people and in informing the rest of the world that the whole problem boils down to a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and maybe Jerusalem. So they have ruled out the discussion of the refugees. They said this is a final status issue to be resolved later. They have ruled out the issue of Jerusalem. That's another final status issue to be resolved later. They have ruled out Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel, 2 million of them that Sabri Jiryis talked about. They were not even mentioned anywhere in the two-state solution. They are supposedly an internal Israeli problem. They have ruled out genuine freedom and genuine independence by making the two states somehow a hybrid, strange solution that needs to be negotiated to the satisfaction of Israel itself. And they, of course, avoided the real problem of settlers taking over land in Israel, in the West Bank, because they said, well, we'll talk about that later. Meanwhile, the settlers have become the true lords and masters of the occupied territories. So I wrote this little book asking for people to rethink the perimeters of the discussion, to really start going back to the roots, to really recognize that what happened in Israel itself between 1948 and 67, and even before, is just as important as what is happening now in the West Bank, and is just as important as what the resolution going to be. Because the Palestinian people, against all odds, continue to persist and continue to exist and continue to insist on their identity as a Palestinian people. That's my 10 minutes that I was allowed.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this brilliant presentation. I think you shared with us a journey into Palestinian history, present and future through your own experience. I think it's really interesting how you also mentioned how you personally changed your perspective from advocating to the two-state solution. And then you have now a different perspective. I'm very excited to be shared in the next part of the webinar. But before that, I would like to highlight also something very important you said, the fact that the Palestinian people are fragmented into different categories is a very central part, or it's the basic central tool by which Israel practices its apartheid regime over the Palestinian people. You mentioned the Palestinian refugees who are usually left out of the equation when we're talking about the Palestinian state or the Palestinian self-determination. And they basically constitute around half of the Palestinian population in total. We also have the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are basically under the same apartheid regime. And we have more and more recognition recently of Israeli apartheid by the international community and UN agencies and organizations, where basically Israel is saying under its law that only Jewish people have the right to self-determination. And then we have the people in Gaza who have been under a very comprehensive and brutal blockade for around 30 years now. And we have also this is very sad that we're talking about the Palestinian people being this fragmented and each of them facing different racist and discriminatory policies, but they all pour into the same category within the Zionist Settler-colonial project. And then we have 3 million Palestinians in the occupied West Bank under a very direct military occupation rule. And the people in Jerusalem as well as part of the West Bank, but Jerusalem has been annexed since 1967, and Israel unlawfully implements its Israeli law in occupied East Jerusalem. So it is very important when we think about the future of the Palestinian people and their self-determination to think about the Palestinian people as a whole. And this is, I think it's important, maybe we can now move to the discussion about the beyond the two-state solution. Maybe you can give us some more comprehensive overview of your perspective of how you see the future. And I have a question here, because as far as I understand, the two-state solution is the facts of on the ground. So how do you think it would, how do we approach the two, you call them also mutually exclusive narratives, approach them, and if you are parting these two narratives that are irreconcilable, what's the other solution? Thank you.
Here's what I did in my little book, and it's a slim volume, which is I think easy for people to read and digest quickly. I avoided the basic. I acknowledged that these two movements are mutually exclusive. If Palestine is Arab, then Zionism and Jewish Israelis have no rights here whatsoever. They have some kind of religious, historical attachment, but it means nothing in terms of rights to political sovereignty and rights. But by the same token, if Zionism is correct, there is no such thing as Palestinians or Palestinian nationalism. We're just Arabs who happen to be here and who will be tolerated out of the goodness of their hearts, as long as we know our place and as long as we don't make any national claims. And more than likely, we really need to be accommodated elsewhere in the Arab world, among the Arab countries. So these two movements are mutually exclusive. And we can fight till the death, till the end of both of us, probably, because neither movement has been able to totally negate and demolish the other one, or we can try and find an accommodation. Now, in my view, the accommodation must be based on non-exclusivity. You cannot claim this land to be exclusively yours. Either side cannot do so. And I'm not saying that the two sides are in any way parallel or equal or equivalent at all. One side is clearly the aggressor, and one side is the victim. One side is the oppressor, the colonizer, and one side is the colonized, the occupier and the occupied, the powerful and relatively speaking, the weak. But I'm saying, can they be accommodated? And I take a novel approach. I say, what is it that the Zionists really want? What do they really need? Can we accommodate them without exclusivity? And what is it that the Palestinian Arabs want? What is it that they really need? And can we accommodate them on the basis of equality and respect, and without exclusivity, without excluding the other? And it's a novel idea, and it's a painful idea. For me as a Palestinian, it is painful to have to share my historic land with people coming from all over the world. And I'm sure to some diehard Zionists, it's a painful idea because they wanted their land to be Jewish. For them to think that they have to share it on the basis of equality with another group that is of roughly equal numerical size, and which may even become a majority soon. And they said, that's not why we built the state, to become a minority again. So I try to say, can we accommodate both sides? Can we create a structure that addresses your most basic needs without denying the other through a constitutional, legal, structural framework that addresses those needs, but that doesn't give you exclusivity, that insists on equality and that insists on giving each side with integrity the feeling that this is my country and I can share it and live with another people in it. It's not an easy sell for either party. It requires a lot of rethinking of the whole process. And of course, it requires an end to the kind of powerful domination and oppression and acquisition and denial and demonization that has been our experience so far from the Israeli colonial movement. But I think that approach is a better one to pursue than the current approach, which doesn't seem to be succeeding in achieving anybody's needs. I continue to be a strong believer in human rights and in international law and international institutions, but I see that the state of Israel today has succeeded in using the paradigm of two states as a good alibi to avoid addressing the reality on the ground and to permit it to continue the process of fragmentation of the Palestinians, which we see today.
Thank you, Mr. Jonathan, for the overview of this very interesting perspective. I would like also to hear Mr. Sabri's perspective on this issue of how we perceive the Palestinian future. Do you have a different perspective on how you see the Palestinian future?
I think you should tell him to unmute.
Can you please unmute yourself? No, we can't hear you. Yes. Yes.
Let me present this issue a little bit in a different way. There are two main points, let's say, that are, let me say, they are personal, that shape my position and opinion. The first one is that the two-state solution is not a Palestinian solution. It is an international one. I was, during the 70s, during the formative year of the 70s after the October War, too much involved in these movements, and I was, as we say in Arabic, part of the bones of the neck of the PLO. I was just inside the leadership, the PLO leadership in Beirut and other when we were talking about the two-state solution. First of all, about the national authority and the two-state solutions. When we came to present, a program or let's say a roadmap for having a solution, we were always asked by our supporters the world over, mainly in Russia, China, and too many European countries, if you want a solution, what are you suggesting for the Jews, for the Zionists, for those who are now living in Israel? What is your plan for them? Slowly, it came out the two-state solution. Another certain point say that I would like to stress. Look, I have been living on the Israelis since Israel was born, since Israel was established. I think I know them well. I follow up their, affairs. now on a daily basis for at least half of a century. Daily, I follow up their news and their policies, you know, etc., etc. I must say that Zionism had made them, the Israeli Jews, basically racist, too much racist, too much afraid of everything, and too much isolation. They like isolation. They like to be by themselves. My estimate that if they are forced to choose between a one-state solution in all of Palestine, and on the other side, the state solution of the Tel Aviv, the state, as the Israelis call it, because they have inside Israel, you know, they call it the state of Tel Aviv, differentiate from other parts of Israel. I think they would choose the state of Tel Aviv. They are so much suspicious of everything. A one-state solution, including now Jews and Arabs, I doubt if it would work. And I think it wouldn't. Perhaps after 3, 4, perhaps 10 decades, or perhaps that might happen, but not now. I think the first part, it should be the two-state solution, one way or the other. And I disagree with Jonathan. All of the troubles and the problems which he is pointing at could be solved. Give me sovereignty in Palestine, okay, and I will provide you with all the draft laws and announcements to dismantle all of that artificial Zionist setup in the occupied Palestinian territories. Okay, it's so easy. We have a majority there. They cannot absorb this majority. They cannot eat it, and they cannot, you know, subject it and subdue it for a long period. So I think the first way, the practical way is, first of all, having the two-state solution implemented with a full Palestinian sovereignty, with a full sovereignty for a Palestinian state, just as a full sovereignty is for Israel. And then you start working working all of the other problems, which I think it's so easy to solve them. I suggest, and I have been suggesting, if there are settlers in Palestine and Palestine gets independence, they have to choose. Either they become Palestinian citizens or they have to leave. Israel has 2 million Palestinians. It won't damage, it won't make any, you know, damage to Palestine if it has 100 or 100,000 or 200 to 200 or something like that, 5, 6, 10% of its population to be Jews living inside Palestine. It is not a problem. As we have Palestinian, Israeli Arabs, we could have Palestinian Jews. It's a very small problem. The other one, even the problem of Jerusalem and the final situation and the refugees, all of them could be solved one way or another. Once you agree on that solution, once you agree on the state solution, all of the problems could be solved in a way that would be, I would say, let's say, acceptable to both parties, provided they are sincere and they do really want to solve problems. In Jerusalem, it could be simply a common capital for both countries, for both states, Palestine and Israel, no problem at all, except that the Israelis want, you know, to control it, want everything for themselves. But once they cannot do it, it's simply you can have 2 capitals there, capital for two people. So easy and so practical. As for the problem of the Palestine resources and, you know, managing their lives and so on, once they get their sovereignty, they do their things, they do their affairs their way. after that, you can have a very good cooperation between the two entities, Israel and Palestine. But on the grounds that each of them is a sovereign state and each of them, manages its own affairs. You can even create some sort of a federation between the two entities. But one single state, up to now, I think it is an utopia and it won't work because both parties, are so suspicious and so don't like each other. If I don't say hate each other, they cannot deal with each other. It's so difficult. I see it among, I tell you, I'll just give you one simple example. We have here mixed cities in Israel where Jews and Arabs live. Whenever a certain building, an Arab family buys a flat there, the value of the building of the other flats there drops. And the Jews living there start leaving it, one family after the other. Even after 70 years, you have separate quarters, separate neighborhoods for Jews and for Palestinians, one way or another, in all the mixed cities. They don't intermingle with each other. They don't mix with each other. Everybody tries to keep his way alone. And I think if you have one single state now with the state of animosity and hate and suspicion of one toward the other, it won't work. It won't work at all. Even now, after 70 years, by we now, I mean the Israeli Arabs, the Israeli Palestinians, the 2 million Palestinians, hardly can manage within the Israeli political system. Luckily enough, now they are so divided that we could find our way between this division between the two parts, between the Israeli parties. So I can understand what Jonathan is saying. And on a theoretical basis, it is really very, I think it's nice, it's good, there's no objections to it. But on a practical basis, I don't think it could be solved. It could be, it's feasible. It could be implemented. Not at all. It won't go. Just give every party its independent state and start working on that grounds. Without that, nothing I think would be accomplished. And I am pleased. I disagree with Jonathan that the world like to this state solution because it takes away the other problems and they don't have to deal with it. This is not right because the problems would stay and they have to be solved. And the world, I think, in fact, most of the world agrees to that one way or another because it sees that this is the only practical and realistic way to have a solution. I am not a big admirer or a big lover of the Zionists, and I have never, agreed to their lunacies and whatever they have to look at there, but I am just trying to look towards a feasible, practical, and realistic solution. And I see that only, it could only be made through the two-state solution. Not because I like it, but because I don't find any other way.
It's always a compromise, I think, from what we get from your both proposals for a Palestinian future from the Palestinian side. And here I have some follow-up questions on the very interesting proposal you both proposed. For Mr. Jonathan, I know you talked about the non-exclusivity of both movements. And here my question is, how do you think if we agree to avoid having any of these movements exclusive and trying to address the dynamics of power between a settler-colonial movement and indigenous population. Do you think if we disregard this perspective, we would, let's say, be successful in one state where we all enjoy equal rights? Because the way I see it, if we want to disregard this perspective, let's say the Israeli side see the refugees as a threat, demographic threat to their existence, right? And then if we don't challenge this settler-colonial logic, which why they see the return of the refugees whose return is a right, as a threat to the state. So, for example, by this example I gave, how do you see not challenging this logic and decolonizing the power dynamics between the colonizer and indigenous, working in regard to the refugees, but also on all other levels to ensure that we live in a democratic state?
Okay. First of all, I want to acknowledge that both solutions are very, very difficult. Both solutions run into the danger of the power imbalance. Right now, the reason why there is no two-state solution and the reason why the settlements are being more entrenched and expanding is because there's a power imbalance. So if one state is impossible to achieve, two states is also impossible to achieve under the current power imbalance. So there needs to be, we need to address the power imbalance, and we need to provide some sense of relative justice, if not absolute justice, for the Palestinians in both solutions. So I acknowledge what Sabri Jiryis is saying, that the one-state solution is going to be very hard. But the two-state solution is also going to be very hard. Given the balance in power between the two parties, we need to start thinking in new and creative terms. The specific question that you raised is, does demography and the fears of the demographic demon totally preclude a one-state solution in the minds of many Zionists? The truth is, right now it is. Right now, even from the beginning of the state of Israel, land was important, but demography was important. Ethnic cleansing was necessary to get rid of the Palestinians. And even though the United Nations between 1948 and 67, every single year used to call on Israel to allow the refugees to return, Israel said, no way, that is an existential threat to us. I try to address this in my little booklet by saying, if we can implement structural, constitutional, and legal rights that safeguard the basic needs of the Jews in this land and of the Arabs in this land, regardless of who has 51% of the vote. If we can institute a regime of genuine equality that also recognizes the two major groups as being indigenous, not indigenous, basic, integral stakeholders in the state, that even if they become 40%, they continue to be recognized and respected. And even if the other side becomes 60%, they don't have the right to demonize or ethnically cleanse or disenfranchise the others. You see, people think that democracy means we hold elections and whoever has 51% of the vote can totally ignore and crush the others, which is basically what Israel did with the Palestinians who are Israeli citizens until now. They're 20% of the population, but they really have zero power politically. They have members in the Knesset, but they can't be part of the government. They can be excluded. I am creating a structure where both sides can have their basic rights recognized and safeguarded, regardless of who has the demographic majority. Because until you do that, every additional immigrant that comes in is a threat. Every additional refugee that comes in is a threat to the other side. Every child that is born to one community is viewed as an existential threat to the other community. I want to remove that demographic threat, the demographic demon. I want to speak about a genuine democracy that is robust, that is recognizes and cherishes and fulfills the needs of both communities, regardless of who has 51%. It is an ideal state, and it does require the changing of the power imbalance between the two in order to achieve it. Yes.
Thank you. I will leave the mic for Mr. Sabri if you want to provide your last comments on our conversation as well. And also, I think just from the points you mentioned about the impracticality of the one-state solution, I think one of the things we are being raised into as Palestinian is that we're not even allowed to imagine a future of our own where we see power dynamics are destructed and where we see our rights remedied. So my question to you is, like, when you talk about the two-state solution being the only practical solution, I want to ask about the Palestinian refugees in this two-state solution, as well as I'm not sure if you saw Mr. Jonathan Kuttab analysis on how, let's say, emptying the illegal settler population is impractical as well. So how would you comment on this aspect and also on the refugee question? And if you have any other last comments.
Look, I think the solution wouldn't be between and couldn't be between the Israelis and the Palestinians alone. To our good luck, this whole issue is becoming international one way or another. And almost everybody, at least officially, or at least, let's say, for propaganda purposes, interested in it. You have the Quartet for Powers, the UN, the Europe, Russia, and the United States. You have the Security Council, you have the UN, you have the other world powers. Everybody is interested more or less in that. It is not a problem that the Israelis decide what they have to decide, and then we have to accept what they have planned for us. No, it is not this way. This is an international issue, and on these grounds, our situation is not bad at all. I don't also give too much importance to those settlements found in the West Bank or those, checkpoints which they create here and there. These things are really very artificial, and they stay artificial, and they could be dismantled within a very short time. They will vanish. Just take the military rule away from the West Bank, and let us say dozens of those posts which are established there to control the Palestinians would vanish. They wouldn't stay there. They can't stay there. They don't like to stay there. Now, as for the Palestinian refugees and, the other big problem, I think Jonathan and too many other people are not taking into consideration the factor of history. Half of the Palestinian people are in fact outside Palestine. This is a fact, okay? They have been living there for the eighth generation, the 80, almost 70 years and more. I don't know about all of them, but I have been living with the PLO in Palestine and in Lebanon for more than a decade during the 70s and the 80s. and I have been looking at the situation of the Palestinians there. You have to know one thing. You have to know one thing. There is no Palestinian people per se that are existing now in Lebanon. There is, you know, a Lebanese Palestinians. The Palestinians there, all of them have been intermingling, mixing through marriages with the Lebanese, and a new kind, if you can say it, of a nation has came up, which is half Palestinian, half Lebanese, and people are living there, and people have, you know, managed their lives there. And to be clear and very frank, I doubt if many of them, even if you give them the weather, would like to return to Palestine. I mean, in their body, they would like to go there and live in Tel Aviv or beside Tel Aviv or another way. No, in the contrary. So this trouble, this solution for the Palestinian refugees outside could not be, you know, depending only on the right return, although it is a right recognized by everybody. It should be either return or compensation. And I think the majority would opt for especially those who are well absorbed in their countries, will opt for compensation, not for return, because they cannot leave their societies, new Palestinian societies, new Palestinian diaspora have really been created in all of these countries. Take the same in Syria, the same in Jordan. And in Egypt, it is this. In other countries, it is this. So dealing with the Palestinian refugees question as if we are now in 1948 or 1949 or 1950, it is a big mistake. It's not going this way. It has vanished. The situations have changed very much, and you have to follow it this way, and you have to see it this way. And you have to be practical and see not everybody is going to return to Palestine, even if you give them the right. Because their interests are not in going back, but rather in managing their affairs one way or another. Now, still, I think the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, provided it has full sovereignty and it has the good administration, could really contribute to solving the Palestinian question. If somebody wants to go to Palestine, he can return there. If some other people want to go to Israel, but I think in a limited scale, it could be done there. And one way or another, you can find a solution for all of these problems. I have an impression that people living in the West Bank under the occupation are slowly getting that mentality of the occupation and thinking that the occupation is everything. No, it is not everything. And Israel is not everything. They cannot deal with themselves. They cannot do what they see. They cannot execute whatever they want to do. Even with us, the Arabs inside, the Palestinians inside Israel, they have been trying, all kinds of ways to subdue us, to control us, and so on. But slowly and slowly, they are losing control. Now we are, in a certain way, are playing with their political system. Although what we have now, we have lost some five seats in the Knesset. We have now 10 instead of 15. But we are, some sort of a balance between both parties. And we are not powerless. It's not only does not depend only on Palestinians and what is going on the West Bank and the military governor. The military government there would go to hell. It has to go there. It has to be dismantled and thrown away. And once that happens, the situation changes radically, in my opinion.
Thank you. I think we're approaching some time for questions, Q&As. But before that, I would like to give the mic to Mr. Jonathan for his last comments on this discussion before we move to Q questions and answers.
Yes, I think Sabri is correct that once you give up the military government and give up the support that the settlers have, they have nothing. But part of what I said in my book is that the settlers have succeeded in ingraining themselves within the Israeli power structure to the point that no Israeli government can act against their interests and can act to force them out of their privileged position, or
The
can
coming,
act.
the coming Israeli administration would do that.
خليني أكمل صبري.
They would do that. They would do that.
In my book, I went through 3 separate attempts where the Israeli government tried to remove settlers because there was enough international and even national Israeli requirement to remove those settlers. And both the 3 incidents that I mentioned, the Gush Qatif in Gaza, the 7,000 settlers in Gaza, the attempt to remove the settlers from the heart of Hebron, just 400 families, and the recent attempt to remove settlers from Amona settlement. Again, just a very small number of people in a settlement that was considered illegal by the Israeli government and by its military administration. The amount of energy, money, resources, and government power that was required to remove them, and the cost within the Israeli system was so high that it is impossible to imagine this happening to all of the settlers, to several 100,000 settlers, Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. Now, as everybody, I think, recognizes, and some of the questions, I think, are around that, to achieve that, you really need to defeat the Zionist colonialist power structure. You really need to make some radical changes. You really need to struggle towards that, both internationally and locally. And you also need to get enough people on the ground to support this progress. My only question is, can this be done within the framework of 2 states, or can it be better done within the framework of 1 state? And I don't think the issue is just how people feel, anger and hatred and inability to live together. We can overcome that much more easily than overcome the privileged position and the rights that people have. People can, in fact, live together. People can, in fact, find a modicum. You are right that you need a lot of international power and a lot of international involvement to do it, because people don't easily give up their rights, their privileges, not their rights, their privileges. In South Africa, the whites didn't just one day wake up and say, you know, it's better to have equality. The slave owners in America didn't one day rise up and say, you know what, slavery is bad. We want to give equality to the African Americans. The colonial powers didn't one day wake up and say colonialism is wrong and imperialism is unjust, and we really need to give all these people independence. No, people had to fight for it. People had to work for it. There had to be enough pressure, internal and external, to force people to give up their privileges. And I'm saying that this fight still is required, and we really have to deal with it. But at the same time, we have to be able to find a formula that can lend itself to such an eventual outcome. As I said, the 2-state solution, I was one of those who believed in it long before the majority of Palestinians and the international community accepted that solution, because it is necessary to find a compromise. And it was the settlers, it was not the Palestinians who rejected the 2-state solution. It was the Israeli governments who systematically undermined that solution and made it, I think, very difficult to achieve.
If I may here add last comments of my own voice on what I see as future for the Palestinian people. To be honest, whether it's a one state or a two state or whatever form of existence, I think the most important thing for the Palestinian people is that there should be acknowledgement by the Zionist movement that they have been colonizing the indigenous Palestinian people for over a century now, and there should be a deconstruction of the power dynamics, recognizing who has been colonized and who has been controlling the whole land since this time. And there are many steps to arrive at a future where all the people are living in a just and reconciled future. We have the criminal justice aspect of it, which Mr. Sabri highlighted in the recent developments at the International Criminal Court, where there's a possibility for prosecution of Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territory. But this is only one aspect, because we have also other aspects of justice that are even more important than that, which is the restitution and the reform. Restitution, compensate. I see a very important comment in the chat box where one participant is saying that I will read the comment just to. He's saying, respectfully, I disagree that living in a camp in Lebanon is preferable to returning to a reconstructed village, which is possible. The land is empty and ready for refugees to return. Practical plans have been put in place for all villages to be reconstructed, with almost no displacement of existing Israeli communities. And here, I think I would just want to stress this point made by the participant, that there are already studies highlighting that there is practicability in the return of all refugees to Palestine. And this is only also like one level of the justice that the Palestinian people deserve as a whole. And turning to the Q&A, we have many interesting questions from the audience for our speakers. I don't know if you prefer to have me read the questions all, or just go question by question. I can read the first.
I think you should select the most relevant ones, and we'd be willing to address them.
Okay, I see many of the questions asking about the current developments now regarding the elections on both sides. So we have the first question saying, could you comment on the upcoming Palestinian elections and opportunities they may carry, if any, for more unified Palestinian leadership? I think there's another question on the election in Israel. I think we can answer both of these by our speakers. The question on the elections in Israel is for Mr. Sabri. They're asking, how would the program of Al-Ard in the 60s compare to that of Al-Balad today? Would Al-Ard be barred from election today as it was then? And what do you think Palestinian citizens should do now to advance their struggle for equality in light of the split and huge drop for the joint list in this week's election? I will leave our speakers to answer these two questions on the elections. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Well, I can answer on the Palestinian elections. Palestinians love democracy. We love elections. Even without a state, we have elections to student government, to NGOs, and then they become very vital opportunities to express ourselves and to choose leadership. Unfortunately, political elections are governed by the fact of who is allowed to vote and what are they voting for. Many people have been told, you're not allowed to vote in the next elections because they may introduce Hamas into the equation. And in fact, people have been told, if you run for elections, you will not see your family for many years. Other people have been told by the Israelis, you can vote, But then if we don't like the results of the vote, like we did the last time, we will arrest those who we don't like, and or you will not have the power to really exercise the vote. The current Palestinian Authority would love to be a state, would love to be a genuine government. In fact, it is not. It doesn't have the power. It doesn't have power over borders. It doesn't have power over economy. It doesn't have power over taxation. It only has power over its own people. And that power is, as often as not, used at the direction of the Israelis to keep the people under control so they will not resist. So elections by themselves are a good idea, but the election for what? Towards what end? And whether they lead to real empowerment or whether they are just a cover for continuing the status quo. This is my feeling.
Thank you. Mr. Sabri, would you like to answer the question on the Israeli elections? Would you like me to?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank God we had so far 4 elections within less than 2 years. Okay, we love elections very much here in Israel. And it looks like we are going to have the 5th election within, let us say, less than half a year. And now, look, the problem is very easy. There is a huge, deep, and big split in Israel. There is a crisis in the Israeli political system, and everybody is trying to solve it, but nobody is succeeding in doing that. So that's why we have so many elections, and that's why we might have elections again another time within a very short period. Now, looking away, let's say from far away on this situation, I can say that I love it. It's deepening, and it is, exposing the real crisis in Israel and pushing the Israelis more and more toward being realistic and looking for for practical solutions. And I think more or less, it looks like they are coming more and more next to that, to this position. Look, for example, now there is a very, strange movements of having left and right, religious and non-religious, Arabs and Jews, who are trying to form a government, while the others are trying to do other way. So I think there's a very deep movement, very deep and sincere movement towards a change. What comes of that up to now is not so clear, but I think it would be good. And I hope it would be better with the time coming more and more. So don't expect us here in Israel to have easy times. There are no easy times here. The campaigning and the election, it's one of the big issues, although people are getting tired of it, but still every time they go on and practice it. And we shall wait to see what's going on, with the other elections. I hope for the better.
Thank you. I think we can take another 2 questions from the chat box. We have a question not addressed to anyone in particular. Why have the Palestinian people not been able to mobilize the support they have internationally? And what role does Palestinian leadership play in this regard? This is the first question. And the other question is, how is the two-state solution possible without deconstructing the racist Zionist regime? And how is the one-state solution possible without deconstructing the racist Zionist regime? So I think this question is for both our speaker. And the first one is about the leadership and mobilization of our support internationally?
I think this should go to Jonathan.
Okay. Well, the late Yasser Arafat used to say that the Palestinian people are much, much better than their leadership. And
Yeah,
I would say,
that's right.
he is right. The Palestinian people, inside and outside, have been very active to try and mobilize support for their cause by people of goodwill throughout the world. They have made great successes, but they also have not succeeded yet in dismantling, according to the second question, the racist Zionist regime. I think one of the best ways that that can be done is by increasing the political, economic, diplomatic, and moral cost of the continuing racist regime, which is why the BDS movement is so vital, so important throughout the world for people of goodwill, churches, mosques, students, unions, writers, people of goodwill, including a lot of Jewish people and young people throughout the world are saying that what is happening is so evil, so wrong, so contrary to decency and morality. And they're willing to do something about it. They're willing to boycott. They're willing to ask for sanctions, to make people pay a price. And I think the state of Israel today is more worried about BDS than it is about Iran or any other supposed military threat, because they recognize that the state of Israel lives today because of support as well as the silence and the tolerance of people throughout the world. We live in an interconnected world today. No state can be an island. Israel cannot afford to be the pariah state that South Africa was for many years. Sooner or later, it has to face the reality that what it's doing is immoral and unjust and unfair, and it can no longer claim to be a democracy while it is ruling over another people, which is why, by the way, the two-state solution tries to give them an alibi. Oh, this is just temporary until Palestinians have their own state. This is not our problem. Within Israel itself, we're very democratic. It's just this little occupation. Once it's over, we'll be fine. When in fact, it's not fine. The entire system is an evil, colonial, racist, and discriminatory state. And we have to work hard to bring that to an end, not just in the West Bank and Gaza, but also throughout historic Palestine.
Thank you. I think we have the fourth question that I raised. It's addressed, it can be answered by both of you, which is saying, how is the two-state solution possible without deconstructing the racist Zionist regime, and the same for the one-state solution?
I think I answered it, but Sabri has, I'm sure, a response.
Look, some people have to stop talking about dismantling the racist Zionist regime. It is racist. It is existing. But dismantling it in that sense, meaning that you would like to abolish everything as if nothing has happened, this is a dream. That couldn't be done. Okay, you have a state that have been existing for more than 70 years. It has its own system, it has its own laws, and it has its people. I mean, you have to change the system, not to dismantle it. You cannot dismantle it. You have 8 million or something more, something like that, Jews, and too many Zionists in them. and you want to deal, let's say, when you say dismantling, you have to look at them as if they are not existing. They are. You are I mean, whoever said dismantling this, it's a dream. You have to adopt, to change the system, to make it better, to try to, you know, to direct towards, let's say, positive venues or other words. You have to make it a change, to press on it, to have pressure, let's say, local, international, Arab pressure, all kinds of things, and to make the correction gradually. It's the question is not dismantling, it is changing, it is repairing, it is improving the system. And those who are saying this, the dismantle or this, in fact, I have nothing to do with them. It couldn't be done. It's an utopia. You have 8 million Israelis are living with system, etc., etc., etc. You have to deal with the coming system and try to improve it and change it. To dismantle, it means you have to throw away all of the state of Israel, which couldn't be done. And it's a dream. So let us say about changing, change a little bit the wording or the phrasing. We have, you know, to improve that system, to press it, to make it more realistic, more practical, and to deal with the problems that everybody is saving, either Israelis or Palestinians, in a rational way. This is the way to do it.
Which is exactly what I was saying. That we have to remove the exclusivist
I am
aspects of it.
answering the question. Those who claim that dismantle, or those who would always dismantle. I mean, if you have the BDS working, it's okay. But if the BDS would say, let us say, we want to dismantle the Israeli system, I think it would. I don't think it would work. It looks an utopia. It's not. I mean, it's not practical. We want the Israelis to change their policy. Yes, that's right. And you will find too many forces that, you know, join with you and work with you. Changing that racist system, making it better, make it more democratic, more equal to all others. That's okay. And I think in this aspect, you will find too many world forces that are going to cooperate. They understand, they cooperate, not only in the official level, but also on the popular level.
Thank you, Mr. Sabri. I think we're unfortunately running out of time, but I would like to give one last minute for each of our speakers to give his wrap-up comments today. If you have anything to say as a concluding comment.
Look, let me start. I feel really a little bit more calm and more pleased and more hopeful about what is going on in both the entities, locally in both Palestine and Israel, and even at the world in general. Okay, I mean, I think at least the world policy as it says now, it is toward finding a solution to this problem. We have got rid of the Trump fantasies. The US and the other world powers and the local powers are more and more coming back to reality. And I hope more paths and more measures would be taken towards really starting, at least to start working on a realistic solution. And for some reason or another, I think we might see some progress in the coming months or the coming years. Well, we leave the away, but I think in the coming month, we are supposed to see some kind of progress, which is not bad at all. We are also seeing some kind, despite what might be thought otherwise, we are seeing some good signs inside Israel itself. Even Excellency Netanyahu, that big racist, has, believe it or not, been posing as a moderate and looking forward towards dealing with the Arabs, with the Israeli Arabs and their representatives. Of course, his aims might be strange, but still, you can see the roots of change. And I think that would go on and making things in general better than they are.
I would also want to echo the hopeful note of Sabri. The situation is not as hopeless as people think. The Palestinian people, with every possible disadvantage, has persisted, has resisted, has stayed on the land, has refused to lay over and play dead, had insisted on its identity and on its rights. And I think with every possible advantage on their side, the Zionist movement has failed to do away with Palestinians and with Palestinian nationalism and with the Palestinian people and their identity, which is why right now they are most worried about delegitimization, about losing the kind of massive support which enabled them to exist so far. And the only way they can continue is by becoming more and more right-wing, more and more oppressive, more and more fascist, and therefore losing the basis which has allowed them to win and succeed so far. So I am full of hope about the future. I think I agree with Sabri that we have to change the situation, not to eliminate. We cannot eliminate what exists. We can only try and make it more just, more equal, more democratic, which is why, by the way, I think thinking beyond the two states is a very hopeful thing, because I think that our chances of moving towards a better reality are going to happen and are going to really surprise people how quickly they will happen when they come about. I want to thank all those who are supporting us, because many of them are not doing it out of individual motive as much as out of a feeling of justice and fairness and caring for all the people in that area. Thank you very much, Aseel and Karen, and thanks for those who put together this wonderful opportunity.
Thanks a lot. It was such an amazing discussion going through history, present time, and an optimistic perspective for the future as well. Thanks a lot for Just Peace Advocates for organizing this webinar. And I just want to re-emphasize something that has been said in the very beginning of the webinar. Mr. Sabri mentioned that 10 days ago, the Israeli occupying forces killed a Palestinian in Beit Dajan, a village in Nablus in the occupied Palestinian territory. His name is Atif Youssef Hanaisha. And this story is very similar to what happened in 1976, portraying the ongoing process of colonization. Atif was killed and shot with live ammunition in the head while he was peacefully protesting land expropriation in his village. And this is part of the ongoing weekly protest that has been going for around 4 months in Beit Dajan village. So this is just an incident to end up and to say that land dispossession is historical and ongoing, and that Palestinian resistance is also persistent and ongoing till our future of justice is seen. Thank you for everyone who's watching us, and apologies for not being able to answer all the questions for time limitations, but you can find the recording of the webinar on the Facebook page of Just Peace Advocates, and it will also be posted on the YouTube page. Thanks a lot.